Hello again everyone. Recently I tested a very unique new lens which is only for Canon's new EOS R mirrorless cameras, the incredibly interesting 800mm f11. With its collapsible design and lightweight, good image stabilization and good image quality, in my opinion it's a real winner, although more demanding photographers might balk at the lens's very dark fixed aperture of f11. Today I want to take a look at its smaller brother, which was released at the same time, Canon's RF 600mm f11 IS STM. Now, a 600mm f11 lens might not be quite as exciting as an 800mm one, but the shorter focal length offers some real advantages. The 800mm lens was still quite a large piece of kit in absolute terms, if not relatively so. This 600mm option can be much smaller. In fact, when collapsed, it's barely any bigger than my 70 to 200mm lens, as you can see here. That makes the 600mm lens a lot more portable than the 800 and considerably lighter too, weighing under a kilogram or just over 2 pounds. It's less expensive too, being $700 or £750 in the UK, compared to the 800mm lens, which is $900 or £950 in the UK. $700 for a good quality 600mm lens could be a serious bargain. And the 600mm focal length, while not as exciting as 800mm, is still an extreme telephoto angle of view, but a little easier to work with. You'll find it a little easier to get sharper images at that slightly wider angle. It really makes sense to me that Canon launched both of these lenses at the same time. It's great that we're given a choice, and the 600mm lens is just a bit more of a sensible option overall, in my opinion. Although, as you can see, you can still get some amazing telephoto images with it. Let's take a look at the lens's build quality. It is the same as the 800mm option, but obviously smaller and lighter. It manages to feel plasticky and quite light, while still managing to feel fairly solidly put together. It feels relatively lightweight, but not cheap. It's still based on a metal lens mount, but I doubt that this lens is particularly weather sealed. There's no gasket on the rear mount anyway. We get the usual assortment of controls on the side here for image stabilization, autofocus and focus limiting, and on the bottom there's a small but effective little tripod mount. When it comes to image stabilization, here's some footage from the lens with it turned off and now turned on. As you can see, it works very effectively, especially combined with the extra stabilization of a Canon EOS R5 camera. I regularly found myself getting sharp pictures at 1/15th or even 1/20th of a second with this lens. The focus ring is made of plastic and turns reasonably smoothly. It's electronically coupled to the focus motor and only works averagely responsively. Some good news is that the lens doesn't seem to display much in the way of focus breathing, keeping its long focal length wherever you happen to be focused. Now let's take a look at the lens's autofocus system. On a Canon EOS R5, I found it worked very well really, functioning pretty quickly, quietly and fairly accurately, not missing my subject very often. The autofocus points are limited to a broadly central region of the image, and that can be annoying if you're tracking something that moves out of the central box. However, the lens also works well with the animal eye autofocus feature on the Canon EOS R5 and R6. On the lens, you also get one of Canon's control rings here. It's the silver one near the front. It works with gentle clicks and can be used to control a number of things like ISO levels or exposure compensation, but not aperture. This is a fixed f11 lens, its aperture cannot change at all. Something else that's different about the 600mm lens is that it's easier to see the concentric diffractive optics rings on the front glass element than on the 800mm lens. This lens does use diffractive optics in part, also known as a Fresnel lens, to make it as small as it is, which is always cool to see, although they can soften a lens's image quality. The lens's filter thread size is a large 82mm wide. It comes with your standard front and rear lens caps, but doesn't come with a hood or a carry case, although these will be available separately. Overall, the lens works fantastically well and it's light and comfortable to use, being much easier to use handheld than any other 600mm lens I've tested. Now, on to image quality. Canon's EOS R cameras are currently only full frame, and this lens has both a fixed focal length and fixed aperture, so this won't take long. We'll be testing it on a 45 megapixel Canon EOS R5. In the middle of the image, we see good, but not great, sharpness, and contrast is slightly on the low side here. Bear in mind that the effects of diffraction are already setting in at f11, which would definitely explain why the lens isn't quite razor sharp here. Let's look in the image corners. They are just a little softer, but still pretty good. Overall, I think this lens's image quality is more than satisfactory. Even on a very high resolution camera sensor, it draws out a good amount of detail from whatever you point it at. I can also tell you now that this 600mm lens is basically as sharp as the bigger 800mm version. When it comes to distortion and vignetting, the lens projects some negligible pincushion distortion here, and there's some mild vignetting too, which your in-camera corrections should be able to clear up quite nicely. Let's take a look at close-up image quality now. The lens has quite a long minimum focus distance of 4.5 meters, which is not as bad as the 800mm lens, but still makes shooting smaller subjects a bit tricky. Anyway, its close-up images seem to be just slightly softer than those taken at normal distances. Now, let's see how the lens works against bright lights. That was a slightly tricky thing for me to test actually. Here we can see that the lens shows just a little flash of flaring when a bright light is in or right on the edge of the image, but otherwise contrast is holding up very well indeed, and I don't think you'll really need to purchase that expensive hood. One thing to note though is that if you're shooting a dark scene using a tripod, then bright points of light will produce quite an unusually strong halo effect, as you can see here. And finally, let's take a look at the quality of this lens's bokeh. At 600mm you can still get some reasonably out of focus backgrounds despite the very dark aperture of f11, and the good news is that those backgrounds generally look very nice and smooth. I never noticed anything offensive in them, except perhaps a slight jumbling if the background is complex. Overall though, I loved this 600mm lens, even though it's obviously not for everyone. That aperture of f11 will certainly be a stumbling block to many customers, but to me, it's the reason the lens can be so small and light, which then sets me free to actually get out and take pictures with it and use it, unlike other bigger 600mm lenses. It does have its limitations, but you won't find a much more fun lens for birdwatching or going to the beach if you're anything like me and dislike gigantic lenses. So for me, for the convenience factor and decent image quality and reasonable price, it certainly does come recommended.